people, because of fear, they create these unnatural dependencies where you're going to say, I'm going to do something when something happens. I'm going to do this when this happens. And if you operate like that with a startup in your life, you will never get anywhere because you always have a reason not to do something. And ultimately, fear is what's holding them back. And so you have to push yourself, take that risk, and eliminate those dependencies, whatever they are.
Hello and welcome. This talk is one of our new Startup Grind series. We are doing one virtual event per month. These virtual events kind of air more on the side of a workshop or some specific topic that a founder, regardless of the stage that they are in, we think they can provide some value to the audience, which is you. This also adds the benefit that we can reach people that are not necessarily in Omaha and able to come to our in-person events. Even if you aren't in Omaha, you can check those events out that we did in person. If you go to startupgrind.com/Omaha, all of the events are there and the recordings are there. So there's a lot of really great interviews with very experienced founders who have exited companies or grown companies to scale. There are a couple of interviews with investors, lots of great stuff you can learn as a founder or an investor yourself. In this webinar, we're going to interview John Bunting, who is the founder and CEO of Beeso Studio. Viso Studio talks to hundreds of startups a month, possibly over 1,000 to almost 2,000 in the last 2 years while they've been around. I will let John kind of dive into his background here in a second and allow him to talk a little bit more about what it is that Beeso Studio does. But the focus of this talk is, how do you set yourself apart as a founder? How do you show that you are a great founder for investors? And if you're an investor or interested in investing, how do you assess startup founders? We all know that that's an important factor in whether a startup succeeds or fails. So how do you go about assessing yourself or the founders that you're thinking about working with? What are those traits? What are those attributes that John sees through all of the startups that he's been working with and in his experience? So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'll let John give a little introduction of himself.
No, that's great. I appreciate the intro, Craig. I mean, a little bit about my background, as I was mentioning, worked for EA Games in California. It was an interesting time to talk about for a second. Is that it was in 2007, 2009, and if you remember, the iPhone was introduced in 2007. Android devices were just coming on the scene. You had, when I was there, they released the iPad. They announced the iPad, the first iPad. So it's just it was a fascinating time to be there because there was this huge explosion of mobile games, and it was a huge shift from these phones that you would use, like, keypads and stuff, and to these touch screens, and it was just a huge shift. So it was awesome to be there at that time. So I um, spent several years at EA Games. I also worked for a bunch of different car companies, doing IT projects for them. And then moved into, worked for University of Phoenix for a while, doing stuff in the education space. And then eventually I moved to Las Vegas, Nevada, co-founded a startup studio there, ran that startup studio for a couple of years in Las Vegas. And then by chance, I ended up here in Omaha, Nebraska, which is kind of an odd place to land, but this is where I've landed. And when I got here, I kind of realized that there wasn't, startup studios, there's roughly about 500 of them worldwide, and most of them are outside the United States. And when I got to Omaha, when I started looking around the landscape and just what is going on in this area in the Midwest, I realized there wasn't a startup studio here. And so because of that, because of just my experience of working at a startup studio previously, I thought it made sense to start Beeso Studio, a startup studio here. We're located in Omaha, Nebraska. One of the great advantages I think we have is that we have a development team in Jakarta, Indonesia. Through actually living in California, I was able to develop relationships with our VP of development. He lives in Jakarta, Indonesia. We do our development there. And then we're able to basically come in and help give guidance and accelerate and do things very capital efficient for our startups that we work with and help get them to scale, take them from an idea to customers to revenue and get them growth. And that's really where our expertise is.
So with that, and I know the context that you have, within Beso, you and the team have talked to thousands of startups. What is that perspective like, as far as, especially in the really early stage? I know that a lot of the companies that you talk to are incredibly early, like pre-product, sometimes actual napkin idea, or just kind of formulating the idea stage. What are some of the things, and how did you come about kind of noticing that it was important to try to assess the founder at that early of a stage, and kind of what are some of the things that you've noticed doing that?
Yeah, no, great question. Our VP of partnerships, Jake, he's sort of formulated, and this is probably true. We talked about 1,000 startups a year,
Hmm.
roughly 100 or so a month. And like I said, we talk to startups all over the world, different ideas, different founders, different backgrounds, and such. And for us, it's a very interesting experience because we learn a lot around what makes a good founder. The ideas, obviously a factor, but the founder, their personality, their background is also a factor.
So with that, what are some of those key characteristics that you have noticed and that you look for when talking to founders?
The one thing about founders, what's interesting, in going back to the ideas, like we talked to a lot of people with a lot of different ideas, and I feel like we're able to, judge and evaluate really how great that idea is. And a lot of that is a very analytical approach where you look at revenue, you look at market, you look at, total addressable market, the competitors in space, you build out financial models, you formulate, okay, this is the product that would, be disruptive or go into that white space. Point is, those are very analytical. Um, the part that's a little bit more challenging to really measure and understand is the founders themselves and the characteristics that make a good, successful founder. And I can tell you that a lot of times, those are very hard things to measure. And I think a lot of the, key characteristics there are just somebody who's determined and has a lot of drive to push something forward, even though there's going to be challenges. A lot of people get into a startup, they start working on it, and they realize it's a lot more difficult than they thought. Uh, they are required to step out of their comfort zone. They have to do things they've never done before. One of those key things is sales. I think a lot of founders are very much about, hey, I want to go build this product, but they don't think about the customer. They don't think of how am I going to grow this and get revenue. Um, and so those are things that we're really looking for as a founder that's forward thinking, who can take themselves out of their comfort zone and start doing things they're really uncomfortable with, but able to push themselves forward. And there's a degree of resilience in terms of the challenges that you're going to face with growing a business, especially with a technical startup. So we work with tech startups all day long. That's our space that we operate in. And technical startups are they're just a different entity versus starting a brick and mortar business. Doing a technical startup, sometimes you have a technical founder, sometimes you don't. And especially those technical startups that are started by somebody who's non-technical, they have to attract and rely on a great technical team and a team that they can trust. There's a lot of things that come into that mix. And I would say that's really what we do is we talk to these people and we evaluate and try to figure out who's got
Hmm.
what they are. Uh,
So
but
you,
I have seen, to your point earlier, go ahead.
oh no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, to your point earlier, we have seen great ideas fail because of the founder. To sum
Mm,
that up, I mean, it is,
yeah, yeah, I do.
founders, great ideas, and it's unfortunate. It kills us because we're like, that's a great idea. You can
Yeah,
get traction, and we see positive things. And sometimes founders are afraid of success. Sometimes founders are afraid of getting out of product and focusing on sales. There are varying reasons.
we see this a lot, that the first version of the product should scare you a little bit. One of our founders said something about, we had no business putting that product out into the market, but we did, and then we made it better. And I think that, founders might hear that and go, yeah, yeah, of course. But then when it actually comes time to do it, it takes a little bit of courage or a lot of courage to
Absolutely.
do that.
We had sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt. I was gonna
No,
say
go ahead.
we
Go
had
ahead.
an instance that we literally had a product, and it was a functioning product. It was great. The founder, we literally had a meeting with their first customer, and the first customer says, "Yes, I want to use this. Let's start tomorrow." And for whatever reasons, the founder, going back to that comfort level, they wanted to spend more time on development and
Mm,
not push it forward into sales, even though they're a little bit embarrassed. It wasn't quite where it needed to be. That is kind of where their mind was at. And because of that, that window of opportunity closed. On the other hand, we have a founder that we're working with right now, and actually we did a demo today, and he made the comment, "This is the best I've ever seen it, and I'm no longer embarrassed." And keep in mind, this product has been in the market for over a year. Customers are using it, they're creating revenue, but he commented, "I'm always embarrassed the way this looks. It's not exactly my vision." But in today, a year later, he's like, "It's where I want it to be. I'm so excited. It's going to be where I want it to be." But the point is, even when it was an embarrassing, product, it wasn't, to the level of Facebook or Google or something like that. We were still selling it. We're still getting growth with it. So you have to your point, you have to be comfortable with putting it out there, even though there's some things you're embarrassed about. You drive forward. You're looking at the future vision, where the product's going to be in the future, not where it is today.
yeah, makes sense. So we have a question here in the chat. What are your thoughts on when assessing founders using some kind of like personality quiz, or like one of those personality assessments to, do those assessments, or even for a founder to assess themselves that way?
I think it is to a degree. We've looked at using personality assessments with founders. It's really a hard one to say, because some people, they may just not want to do it. Plus, you know, you, it's very difficult to know, does this person have everything that we're looking for? And truthfully, the personality assessments, in my opinion, they give you some visibility in terms of what that person is like today, but it's hard to predict what they're going to be like in the future when shit gets hard. That's really what it comes down to, because doing a business, doing a startup is very difficult. And when things get really hard, when the pressure's there, it's hard to assess how somebody, in terms of filling out a form and such, how are they actually going to perform under that kind of pressure? And to me, it's there's things that we do to assess them. They probably don't know that, but there are things that we do to assess them.
Mm, yeah, yeah, yeah. We've heard that before from investors and stuff that I've talked to that have kind of asked, like, how do you do those assessments? Is there kind of a criteria? Is it quantifiable? What is in your mind like kind of a list of traits that an investor could use, or a founder could use as like a checklist, basically? Like, um,
Yeah. I think, to list them off, somebody is focused on selling, selling the startup, selling the product, selling the vision, someone who can really energize and make you want to be part of something.
mhm,
Uh, that's absolutely key. Like, is being able to put yourself out there and communicate. There's founders who really don't have a lot. Reality is, it's a facade. They don't have a lot behind them, but they're always out there talking and speaking. And eventually, their startup will catch up with the image that they're portraying. We've seen some founders who have a lot behind them, but because they're silent and they don't sell and they don't communicate, no one knows they exist. And it's
yeah.
unfortunate.
But it's not
Um,
it's not about
so I think,
lying. I think people get confused, and they go like, look at Theranos, or some of these kind of, or WeWork, right? It's not that you need to lie. It's that you need to paint a picture and a vision, and you need to be confident and instill confidence in people that that vision is possible. And then even if it's not real right now, you will figure it out.
absolutely. The other one is dependencies. I think people, because of fear, they create these unnatural dependencies where you're going to say, "I'm going to do something when something happens. I'm going to do this when this happens." And if you operate like that with a startup in your life, you will never get anywhere, because you
Mm,
always have a reason not to do something. And ultimately, fear is what's holding them back. And so you have to push yourself, take that risk, and eliminate those dependencies, whatever they are.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, that's true in life in general. In the startup space, you'll hear the term bias towards action. I mean, it's just a matter of, you know, take action, take the next step, not waiting until, waiting for permission or creating those dependencies. Um, are there any more of those traits that you want to talk about before we move on?
Yeah, the other ones are just, determination, resilience, drive. The last one I was just going to mention here is understanding your limitations. Like I have weaknesses, I have limitations, I have gaps personally. I know exactly what those are. So what I do is I go attract people to basically fill those gaps, to help me, who believe in the vision, who can fill those gaps and help, move things forward. And that's what you want in founders. You want founders who actually know where their limitations are and that they can sell, attract, and bring in those people in their universe who can basically fill those gaps.
So if someone is not great at selling their vision, would it make sense for them to bring in someone that is sort of that sales co-founder?
Oh, absolutely, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, it
go
makes
go.
sense.
If you can't sell, go find somebody to sell. I
Yeah.
mean, if you're
Yeah.
not technical, go find someone who's technical. If whatever those skills are that you don't have, go find co-founder, whoever, to come on board and help you with that. For example, personal experience. One of the issues I have is I am sometimes a little bit overly positive, and we have an advisor. I have an advisor. I meet with him once a week, and he basically helps me level set with where we are in a reality of what I need to focus on. And he eliminates the rosy picture I often think of. And he's like, you need to be
Yeah.
at this, consider these things, these risks. It allows me to basically get grounded by having that advisor. And so you look at your weaknesses and you find people to help you fill those gaps and address those weaknesses.
So on the flip side of that, on the positive traits, are there any kind of red flags that when you're meeting with a founder, you hear about a founder, and you just immediately, you know, notice that okay, this is going to be a problem.
There's one in it. It's an interesting one too for us to address. But as I mentioned, we have a development team in Indonesia. We build software. We do it incredibly well, very skilled at it. But that's one of the things that we do. And so building software is our innate abilities. That's what we do. But one of the things that concerns me is when we meet founders who constantly want to build software, who constantly want to keep adding features and not take it to market, as I mentioned previously. That is an inherent concern we have, especially when their first response is, I'm going to do a startup and I'm going to build something.
Mm,
That's not how you do a startup to be successful. You say, okay, I'm going to have an idea and I'm going to go sell it and find my future customers and find out what they want and what they're willing to buy and separate their money from. Then you go build whatever that thing is, and you build it very incrementally. You build like a version 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4. It goes back to the whole concept of minimal viable product. That is what you should do. As soon as founders tell me they want to go build something, it's a red flag.
yeah, unless they have customers that are, ready already,
Unless they have
ready,
customers and they've done those other steps,
yeah, yeah.
but
Do
they
you
would
think
just want to go build something, like that's a waste.
Do you think that a founder that has like industry expertise that says like I am that customer, is that enough of a validation, or should they be looking for other people that can validate that idea beyond just them?
I think it's going back to getting customers, getting people who are interested, talking to people in their own. And we love that, people in their network, industry experts. They know people, they can call people. They've got some demand. They know there's demand. When you're building a product and you know there's customers for it on day one, and they're paying customers, that's the perfect situation to be in. Too many people think it's the field of dreams. You build it and they will come, and that doesn't happen. So that situation we love. And then it's a matter of, okay, how many customers are in your network you can utilize? And then the next step there is go get a customer you don't know. Go
Hmm.
bring me a customer that's outside your network you've never talked to. and get them to convince them to buy it. Cause that's a whole other level of effort to do that. And that's to me in real validation.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. It's not just like your cousin or something or your college buddies.
Yeah. No, yeah. Somebody launched the startup. This was a couple of years ago. They launched it and they're like, yeah, we just launched today. We got, 30 people signing up. My mom signed up. My brother signed up. My dad's literally, this is what they're telling me. I'm like, none of that has any value. Go
Mm,
find me somebody you've never talked to and get them to sign up, not
yeah.
your aunts, uncles, and cousins. That doesn't count.
Are there any other red flags that a founder could be thinking of or investors could be looking out for?
Yeah, I think, like I said, understanding your limitations. When a founder tells me I know everything and I can do it all myself, that's a concern, obviously. These are life lesson kind of things. Someone who overvalues themselves. When you get on a call with somebody, a founder, and they tell you, they have an idea and they tell you it's worth $10 billion, and you're like, I mean, it's hard not to laugh in these situations, but you're like, let's get realistic. You got to get step one done first. Like, so that is a red flag. People who have unrealistic valuations, unrealistic expectations of where they are. Um, yeah, those are all red flags. Somebody who can't, who doesn't know the details. I talked to a founder.
Mm,
We talk to founders all the time. Anyways, talked to somebody, a couple weeks ago, months ago, and get on the call with him, and he's like, I want to go build all this stuff. And we're like, well, what are you currently doing? He's like, this is what I'm doing. I want to automate our processes. I'm like, great. Let's put together a list of requirements. User stories is what we call them. Put together a list of user stories. Tell me the functionality you want. And a lot of times founders can't sit down at a keyboard and start typing. Like, it's a gap in their
mm,
abilities. Like,
yeah.
that's a red flag. If I tell somebody, write me a paragraph describing what you want, and they're unable to simply do that, it's a red flag, because it means they can't focus, they can't complete a task, they can't, articulate what exactly they want is. Those are all concerns. And that's actually one of the methods we use to kind of weed people out, is we give them simple tasks. Provide us this information, write me a description, do this. We give them simple tasks, and depending on how they perform that task tells me if they're going to be a good founder long term or not.
Yeah, it's like one of those small things like, will you actually respond to an email?
Yeah, these are multipliers in my mind, where if you can't, it's a ripple in a pond. If you can't do the simplest thing
Yeah.
when stuff gets hard, how are you going to handle that?
When you have like hundreds and hundreds of people email you and there's like hundreds of millions of dollars on the line. Yeah, I've heard other investors mention that too. It's like, hey, you know, I asked you for some due diligence stuff and you didn't even, respond to that message. That's like, what are you doing? Which I sympathize with the founder, sometimes because they may be responsive and they may not hear back from the investor in 3 weeks. But it really all comes down to there's a bit of a dynamic of like who needs who more. So what about from the investor side? Like what should investors be looking at, and how can, founders on the flip side of that be making sure that they're, showing their best self to the investors, but really from the investor perspective, how can they assess founders and create kind of those little tests, if you will?
And I appreciate the question. I will give some context on the investor side. One of the things that we do with our startups is we help them raise funding. We are actively engaged with investors, angel investors. We will meet with them. We will tell them, basically, and make introductions. We help get advice on term sheets and equity and all that stuff. So we are actively engaged on the investor side. We have a network of angel investors, investor syndicates, and VCs that we're connected with. And we've had good success at raising venture capital, investment for our startups, in understanding that our startups are very early stage, and yet we've been able to successfully raise funding for them. We'll probably, by the end of the year, we'll probably double the amount of money that we've been able to raise for our startups. So with that being said, going back to what investors are looking for, they're, the investors in our network, the investors that we talk to, they're really looking for startups that can exponentially scale, that can venture scale, get multiples of a return on. They're looking for startups that, are beyond just their aunts, uncles, and whoever their local network is, that they can actually get those customers that are outside their network and be able to track them. And then retaining that customer, keep that customer on board using your product is one of the key things investors are looking for. So they're looking for growth and they're looking for retention of those users. Um, and then investors are looking for founders that are, very engaging, that have a great vision and who have a clear path and roadmap in terms of what they want to follow.
What are some questions that a founder might, or what are some questions that an investor might ask uh, to founders that can kind of help, decide whether or not the vision that they have is realistic, or if the founder is kind of being delusional? Like, where can they figure out that balance, or even how could a founder self-assess and say, am I being, you know, do I have a big enough vision for this? And also, like, am I just being delusional?
You know, that's a hard one. I remember one of our investors told me, actually this weekend I was talking to him, and he's like, he's invested in one of the startups that we work with, and his comment was, I couldn't tell if I was being sold to or if they're actually able to sell the product, um, which is a hard differentiation to distinguish that. And the key thing is that, investors really want to have confidence and really want to see that the risk is being mitigated, whatever that risk would be, that there's mitigations for risk, there's a clear roadmap. Investors want to be able to look at the personality of the founder, making sure that that founder has a good grasp of their reality, and as well as their ability to take that product and get it to market. The other part there is, I also think investors have some, they want a founder who's also resilient in terms of understanding there's going to be some challenges and there's going to be some, things that come up that you have to work through. And the other thing with investors, they want communication. So going back to
Mm.
the communication part, they want regular updates. So they want to know how their startup is going. They want to know how the founder is progressing. And the other point being is, it's a long-term relationship with those investors. Uh, One of the things that people don't realize is that you're not going to make a phone call to go get money from some angel investor who doesn't know you. Your initial investment is based on their personal relationship with you. The more the investor knows that person, the more likelihood they are to invest, especially early stage. Later on, investors who don't know you are investing more in the product than they are in their relationship with you. So that's the other thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting thing that keeps coming up. I think we've seen it with a lot of the founders that we've interviewed through our startup grind chapter, and I've heard you talk about this. And it's kind of, you have to find this balance between having a big vision, but also being able to pull back into the present moment and really see things as they are. Figure out how to, connect those two dots. If you live too much in the big vision, then you come off as delusional, because you're ignoring the minutia of what's happening right now. But if you get too focused on that minutia and the details happening right now, you get an analysis paralysis, and you either aren't thinking big enough, or you may psych yourself out and not make any progress because you're too focused on what's happening right now, and not really the opportunity, and not painting a big enough picture for an investor to be interested if you're not really able to sell that vision. But so it's really like a balancing act of being able to do both.
Yeah. And one thing I will also say, and I learned this. So a while back during COVID, especially during the lockdowns in 2020, I I basically, it's kind of crazy, but I ended up setting up meetings with angel investors, because I knew, the industry, there was a lot of upheaval and a lot of unknowns. And I literally set up calls with angel investors. I probably met with about 400 angel investors in a 3 month period, maybe it was 6 months, 3 to 6 months, we'll say. And I would have these regular discussions with angel investors, and it was fascinating because, to me, I was just making that network connection and getting on a Zoom call and talking to them. But I learned a lot that not all investors are the same. They all don't
Mm.
think monolithically. They have different requirements, different things they're looking for, different industries they're into. different types of, stages for that investment. So some investors like early stage, some investors like seed stage. There's varying degrees. So my comment there is that, just because you go to one investor and they say no, if you're persistent, you maintain relationships with investors, you will find people who are willing to invest.
I mean, they may say yes later down the road too.
We've had
We've
that
seen
because
that.
we have a startup right now raising some funding, and there's investors they've been talking to for 2 years who said no a while back and now are interested.
Yeah. There's a couple of founders that I've talked to that I've talked to as an advisor, and what really impresses me is when they have those monthly updates, whether they are maybe you have a different one for your investors that are already invested in, and then one that's for kind of advisors and people that may be interested in investing. And it keeps people, and it also keeps you top of mind. Some investors only invest in seed or Series A, and you may not be there yet. But if you keep them in the loop, then by the time you are at a seed or maybe even earlier, they now know who you are, and you've built some trust with them, and they're going to be the first people that want to talk to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that just goes back to that communication piece. I've seen that recently a lot, and I just wanted to kind of touch on that.
And you can, the communication side, just one comment. I talked to somebody yesterday about, I always have these conversations, and I said, you can create this pent up demand before your product releases. You can build a landing page, you can, get a wait list generated, and that will give you some validation. And also you can take that wait list and go to the investors and say, hey, look, we got X people signed up for our product as soon as it launches. That. Those are things the investors love to see, that kind of progress and demand and traction, and anything that gives you validation puts you in a better position when talking to an investor. Because keep in mind, the investor is trying to get as much equity as they can for the least amount of investment. And the more value you can demonstrate in the entity and in your startup, that actually helps your leverage in your terms discussion.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially going into the economy we're in. Definitely having as much leverage as you can is important. So if anyone has any final questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. I want to give you the opportunity to just tell everyone a little bit about what Beeso Studio is before we sign off here.
Yeah, so we, as I mentioned, we really have the four core things that we do. We do software development, we do marketing, we help with sales, and we also help startups raise money, raise funding. Some of the services we do have a billable component to them, and some of them don't. And for us, we're trying to help accelerate and grow startups, and we do it very effective, capital efficient, is just really effectively because of our expertise. This is the space that we play in. This is where we operate, and we're really able to help take a startup from an idea to customer to revenue relatively quickly. Especially if you look at the industry statistics, around the 5 to 7 year time frame, and all those industry statistics around getting to some acquisition or some liquidity event. We're certainly tracking. So far, we've been doing this for 3 years. We're tracking ahead of industry stats, are right on target. So we definitely are optimized in that space. The startups that we work with are usually early stage startups where it is somebody who has an idea. They have no product, just an idea, which is a very unique space to play in. There's a lot of people with ideas, and that's why we talk to a lot of founders. There are founders that we work with who have their first MVP done and they need help getting it to a commercial state. And then we've also worked with founders that have a product and they're trying to get it to scale and grow and more on the marketing and sales side. So varying degrees, I'll say. We're pretty agnostic with respect to location and industry. We do have experience, and we've done stuff with marketplaces, with video streaming, natural language processing, AI, machine learning. We have some experience in the medical space, conversational intelligence, sales enablement. Just there's a lot of stuff. Training, learning management systems, transportation, booking engines. I can go on. There's a lot of spaces that we have experience and we play in. So, and then ultimately, if there are startups that think they want to engage us and want to understand more about our process, we certainly go to our website, beeso.io, and we can talk and set up time to discuss. Truthfully, some startups are great for our model and some aren't. And that's where we have those conversations to see if they're right fit or not.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for coming on and talking to us and sharing your insights. Is there anything else you'd like to leave people with?
Yeah, just it's I think from my perspective, what we love doing is building companies, and we enjoy working with founders and hearing about different ideas, different things, getting into different spaces. I know there's a lot of movement on blockchain and metaverse and such, and so those are interesting spaces. There's a lot of movement on AI and machine learning and natural language processing. So we love tech, we love building companies, and that's really what we do. So if anybody's ever interested in learning more about our processes or our model, they can certainly reach out.
All right, sounds good. Thank you for joining us. And thanks everyone who is joined us in the chat or watching later. You can check out startupgrind.com/Omaha to see more of our talks. And you can check out Beeso.io to check out Beeso Studio and what John is working on. Thanks, John.